Okay, good morning and welcome to Bridges of Belonging, everyone. Really pleased to have you here for another week. And this is conversation number 6. And it's been a really interesting journey over the last 6 weeks to have these really incredible conversations with people that I just respect and am so interested in learning from about how we create cultures of belonging as we go forward. I want to begin today by acknowledging the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people and the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations where I live. And I know we have people from across the country joining us and some international guests as well. So I know there's many traditional territories to be respected today. And so given that this is Indigenous History Month in Canada and it was a National Indigenous Peoples Day on Sunday, it's an opportunity to just learn a little bit more about the territories that you live on and to consider what some of the history has been and how to understand the beautiful places where we get to live, work, and play, either as guests or traditional citizens on those territories. My name's Andrea Carey. I am the Chief Inclusion Officer with Inclusion Incorporated, and I've been hosting these conversations for the 6 weeks, as I mentioned, and just so happy to have this conversation today with both Kristen and Darby. I'm just going to do a little reminder on Zoom, so if you can leave your cameras off and stay muted throughout the conversation, that would be fantastic. We will open up the chat box for questions, which you can start posting questions or comments at any point. About halfway through, we'll kind of intentionally flip towards those. And if you do want to ask something directly, you're welcome to do so. And we are recording these sessions, and we'll be sharing this recording with you following today's talk. So welcome to the session. We always kick off with a reading, and today it seemed really fitting to share a reading from Kristen's book, Woman Enough, which I just finished reading last weekend. And so it was really an interesting way to get to know Kristen even better, because we've been having a number of conversations, but just to read her story and to appreciate some of the challenges that she has worked through in order to really find her way to belonging, which you'll hear more about today. So this reading is from towards the end of her book, and I'll just share it with you now. I dream of changing the way sport and society looks at gender. Sport organizations have spent decades requiring athletes to change their bodies based on a strict, binary social construct. A person is either male or female, and each one of those looks a certain way and does not differ. My fervent hope is that people will come to accept the full spectrum of gender and accept that gender issues are human rights issues. Maybe then we'll be kinder to and more accepting of one another as human beings. Sport is international. It's a vehicle through which we can meet and understand one another. Canada has a chance to be a model for the world. The fact that I might have a part in that, perhaps in some way, that's why I became Kristen to do. I lost my first career, sport, to have this career, advocacy. I lost that life where I was a divisive figure to have this life where I hope to be the link between people. Ultimately, it's the right thing for me. If I had been a decorated athlete, it would have been about me. Now it's about everyone. I might have had medals. Now I can have a legacy. And I just thought that was such a beautiful way to wrap up that book and that journey with Kristen. So really excited to welcome Kristen and Darby today. You've just learned a little bit about Kristen. I'm going to read you her bio, and then I'm going to read Darby's bio, and then Darby's going to kick us off. So Kristen is an author, international diversity advisor, and senior designer with planning focus on human-centered design and the built environment. She's very focused on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, leaving no one behind, and how they intersect with diversity while ensuring community, individual health and well-being, and healthy active living for communities around the world. Kristen is a retired high-performance cyclist who has tirelessly been at the forefront of the struggles against sport gender policies for 18 years, impacting women around the world. Transitioned athlete, Kristen was the first athlete in the world who was subject to the IOC's Stockholm Consensus regarding conditions under which athletes who change sex could compete in sporting competitions. For the last decade, Kristen is predominantly engaged with the IOC, World Anti-Doping Agency, and sport, those that are signatories to the Olympic movement. She continues to be an advocate today, and her and I have some very interesting conversations. Darby has over a decade of experience working as an accessibility strategist. She's an expert in universal design and international accessibility guidelines and standards. Darby has successfully contributed to the removal of barriers at the municipal, provincial, and national levels, ultimately establishing more inclusive environments. Darby's expertise in universal design has developed throughout the wide range of roles, including her achievements as a competitive alpine skier. She's committed to contributing her unique lived experience in various political appointments to passionately advocate for lasting inclusive environments that benefit everyone, regardless of ability. So, welcome to our two fantastic speakers. So excited to have this conversation. And Darby, I'm turning it over to you to kick us off.
Thanks, Andrea. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to those that are joining us. I don't know where you all are, but I'm sure you're across the world here. We thank you so much for tuning in and joining us. This will definitely be an interesting conversation. Kristen and I have had great fun the last couple of days discussing this. Other than what sort of Andrea alluded to for me, I'm a former alpine ski racer. I retired back in 2006, actually 2004, my mistake, due to a crash which ended my career, which is too bad. But it's moved me from being that athlete that I was in competing to moving into trying to remove barriers from the built environment. Having cerebral palsy, I was really tired of trying to go out with my friends and enjoy spaces and going to dinner and going to different events and so on. So because of all the barriers that we receive, whether it's because I'm on my scooter or even walking and using washrooms and getting in the door and stuff like that. So I've really taken my passion for removing barriers and starting Level Playing Field, an accessibility consulting firm. And we've worked across the world basically on different projects, mainly in Canada, but we have done some stuff overseas and down in the US. And we're just continuing to try and make a difference every day.
Awesome. Thanks, Darby. What a great way to kick us off. Kristen, over to you to tell us a little bit more about you.
Well, I first wanted to thank both Andrea and both Darby for the last few days we've spent together. It's been, as Darby was just saying, I've just had so much fun with these two incredible women and sharing the stories. And I'm thankful to Andrea for providing this platform for me and Darby to connect, first and foremost, personally and professionally, because I followed her career over many years, and it was always inspiring to me through that specific trajectory. And it's wonderful now to kind of see her in similar parallels to what I've been able to do, taking our lived experience in the sporting world and starting to apply that into the real world and how we can, where those intersects are occurring. So it's been an interesting discussion, an exciting discussion, because I think for both of us, we're seeing where these things are being weaved together and the importance and the values of the lessons that she and I learned in the positive and negative experiences of being diverse in sport and what that structure means and how that applies to the real world. So I'm really excited about that. And for me right now, I've been working within the built environment for many, many years. I grew up in the design industry over the last 40 years. I'm 3 generations in my family. So I've been able to kind of weave a lot of that life experience in terms of my professional side with the sporting piece, and now looking to where we are today and how the intersections between diversity and how that applies across all areas of diversity into the intersections of the built environment. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation this afternoon and sharing with everyone.
A passionate way to kick us off. Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting for some reason. So Kristen, why don't you start by telling us why this matters to you? Like, you've had a pretty interesting journey in sport and now in your career. Why Why? Well, how does that all play out in your life, and how does it contribute to you feeling like you belong in the different spaces and places where you are?
That's a really interesting question in the sense of belonging. It's only, for me personally, I'm halfway through my life, Andrea, and it's only become a recent phenomenon for me in the last probably 2 years, based on my diversity and finding where I've come to in my life, and how, through the gender trends, the gender trajectory in our society, and how that applies to our social acceptance of diversity, and that lived experience, and what that meant to me, and how the system did not support that, and the oppression and the resilience that was put upon me at a national level, but also at an international level. And I knew in my heart that for me it was about, I understood what it was about. I mean, I was a small child growing up with this diversity and having to live in a very conservative environment, and what it meant to not being able to be in an environment that accepted you, and what the negativity implications were to your health, your socialization, your education, the whole, in terms of opportunities, were not predominantly designed for people like me or other people with other diversities. So for me, going through the trajectory of sport enabled me to kind of go through that process and realize that, and something that I was saying to you earlier and to Darby, which we both commonly share, is sport is a representation of that of society. They mirror one another. So my experience as a young person going up through my sporting trajectory, and my life experience at home and so on, was that same experience I was going through in sport, because they're built on the same kind of colonial thinking and elevator shaft, to which prevents a movement forward in terms of how we understand diversity and our shared differences, our shared normals that we share amongst ourselves, in creating an environment that allows us to reach, each one of us to reach our true potential. So I've now kind of moved across that bridge. I'm limited today to what I can say about it, but I am working at the international circles with the leadership of sport, now that this is going on in the last probably 8 months. And we are moving in this very trajectory that we're talking about today, which is a wonderful go forward and an acknowledgement to where the efforts of me and Darby and other people in the circle who are doing this tremendous work in and out of the sports system to change and better people's lives.
Yeah, sport as a parallel to society certainly resonates for those of us that grew up in sport or have worked in the sporting system. Darby, what about you? Like, why does it matter to you? What has your experience been with belonging as you navigated as well some barriers in growing up, and in just sort of how the built environment is structured and some of the systems that limit opportunities when you have different diversity?
Yeah, I think, well, for me, I definitely felt, when I was ski racing, I definitely felt like I belonged, because with our group, having all the different disabilities, everybody was sort of on the same level playing field, where we felt, safe and enjoyed ourselves. But I think as I look now towards the built environment, we've definitely had some really major missteps in regards to architecture and how we build spaces, and how people move within those spaces, and how people feel if they're warm or not warm or welcomed into that. So for me, my biggest thing was to bring that to the forefront and try to mitigate those issues, or try to address, or make sure that as we move forward in the built environment, that these things don't necessarily continue to happen. And that I love my independence. I truly strive on my independence, and for me, I want to be able to go places. I want to be able to enjoy life. I want to go and have fun with my friends. I want to go to a sporting event. I want to show my friends sporting events. And when we've got these barriers that are preventing people with different abilities from attending those events, that's when it becomes a problem, because not all people with different disabilities are sitting at home watching Netflix. We might be now with COVID, not gonna lie, but outside of COVID, we definitely want to be a part of the community, and that's one of the biggest things for me is having that community involvement and allowing people to experience life. For me, I wouldn't be in the position I'm in now without sport. I've grown up, I've had a family that has been very actively involved in hockey. And then we went from hockey, and then I moved into skiing because, well, I just didn't have the ability to skate. We could do that, but that would be, Bambi on Ice and a YouTube channel, which might be fun. But for me, the sporting aspect made me the person I am today, and especially as a person with a disability, I push families that have other individuals with disabilities into the sporting world so that these kids can participate and move forward in these sessions and enjoy life and get the life skills, but also be part of the community.
No, that's amazing. So with Level Playing Field, tell us a little bit about that and some of the work you're doing. And, you've spoken about why that matters, but, how did you kind of build that and decide that that was a pathway where you could make an impact?
Well, for me, I volunteered quite heavily coming out of being a ski racer, and really worked hard with our city of Calgary here locally on some accessibility issues, and really found a passion for it, and decided that, hey, maybe I should actually stop volunteering my time to make this difference and start Level Playing Field. So 5 years ago, I started Level Playing Field. We've got a team anywhere between 5 and 7 of us, depending on the workload and what projects we're on. And we've worked to mitigate these barriers and remove them and make people feel they're warm and welcome. One of our biggest projects here in Calgary is the brand new Calgary Stampede BMO Expansion Center, which is our big convention center. And so it's going to be fun to try and make a difference, because as somebody who's a born and raised Calgarian, Stampede Park is part of my life for the 10 days of July normally, and having somewhere to go where we can have different events and conferences. Level Playing Field uses the BMO for our education seminars. So by working on that project and that expansion project and making sure that we can mitigate those barriers is hopefully a step in the right direction. And ultimately, we love to follow along and work in all different aspects. We work in festivals, we work in sport too. It's just all in the matter of who's willing to have the conversation and bring the accessibility to the forefront, knowing that there is actual clientele and people that want to use the space.
And Kristen, what about you? Like, you also are really focused on design and how we build spaces and places. How does that show up for you? How did you get into that career? What does human-centered design really mean, and how can others start thinking about that?
That's a great question, and a great question. And I love some of this earlier comments that Darby was speaking to, and I think this kind of lines up to that thinking. I again, as I mentioned earlier, I grew up in this industry specifically, and I've been particularly in the wayfinding signage, and how the understanding of how people move through space. And that's kind of a trajectory that I've been in for a great part of my life, and designing spaces, particularly a lot of the office towers and stadia in Canada and in some parts of the United States that I've been directly engaged in. And for me, it's an interesting intersection for me personally, because it wasn't something to where I would talk about human-centered design right now. It was something I came to through my own personal trajectory and in my own personal experience. And I think that's also part of the discussion that needs to start to happen, is that there's in this kind of broader discussion and education piece around inclusion, the ideas of inclusion, which I'll come back to in a second, is that we need, like in the sporting system, we need people who are survivors or who are having a lived experience lead the conversations. And I think that's a big missing part, because what's happening is a lot of there isn't a lot of that conversation going on. And that's something that Darby just expressed as well, is, starting those conversations. And so the human-centered design piece is something that I know a lot of architects go, oh my gosh, that's a lot to think about, because typically the architectural world likes to shape itself within standards and works within that kind of colonial elevator shaft that we've been hearing about the last 3 months. When we're talking about a lot of the Black Lives Matters issues and issues around race and the lack of diversification and the impact that is having on our social system, and the limits that it's applying to all the different lives of the variances of diversity across our communities, we'll keep it within the Canadian framework, but it is a global issue. That is impacting individual lives and communities. And something that I've worked on specifically, and I know with the WHO, is that in our lifetime, I'm in halfway through my life now, the generations behind me are going now statistically are showing, because young people are moving less. And so in terms of the built environment, the lifespan is going to be on average less. So people are moving less. So young people, based on the high density, using Toronto as an example where I live, within a 3-kilometer diameter, we have a higher density than even though we don't have the same population, we have a higher density population than London or Paris. So people are in these high-rise spaces, and the issue is they're moving less. So they're moving from the office to a high-density workplace, and then they're getting all the recreation and stores and where their purchasing areas are all within basically a 1-kilometer diameter to where they're living. So what's not happening is when we're talking about the ideas around, we hear the buzzwords around sustainability, and I'm also looking at the ideas. I don't use the word inclusion anymore, and I don't use the word accommodation, because what accommodation does is all that does is reinforce in the elevator shaft to which the standards have been developed upon. So when you talk about human-centered design, in principle, before you put pen to paper, I know we're all designing on computers now. The issue is we're moving to a space where we're designing at the very forefront of the discussion how we're trying to move to a design process that allows for resilience, encompasses individual health, community well-being, and how that intersects. And those are the conversations that have to happen at the very beginning of the conversation, in terms of the consultation and design processes moving forward, and not the ideas of building more vertical structure, because actually that's not resolving the issues that we're facing today. It's actually just like monuments are being taken down. It's just confirming that hierarchical structure. So we're learning a lot of great lessons from COVID-19, and that what a lot of architects are watching right now, and is that in 3 months, they're trying to tell the world that all of a sudden we're changing and how we're changing our design process. We got here because of the way they're designing. And it's based on it's something that they're not going to change in 3 months. They're not going to change in 1 year. So what we need to be able to do, very much like the amazing work that you're doing, but also what Darby is doing with her foundation, is being able to lift that conversation, to be able to talk about the issues around accessibility, what that looks like in a health and well-being model as well, weaving the cultures and diversity. So one, we have healthy community and legacy, but secondly, we are ensuring that each person, based on their ability, is meeting their true potential.
Well, and I think too, just to sum up Kristen's, the biggest thing for us right now is we got to see people for people. We got to make everybody feel warm and welcome, no matter if what they are, what color they are, what race, what disability. People are people. And I think right now we've forgotten that aspect, that, you know, we should never judge a book by its cover. And we do that. We've always done that. You know, I get the same scenario when I go shopping. People look at and see how I walk, and then they stare, you know, instead of just asking the questions and stuff like that. So it's all about how we also turn the conversation around to say, how would people use this space in general, and not segregate against the different groups or the different individuals.
Yeah, and I mean, we start the whole conversation, and I think Kristen's point's a really good one. She doesn't use the word inclusion anymore because inclusion, by definition, means people have been excluded. And if we start with people first, and who are they, and how do they show up, and what do they need to be successful, and start there and build out from there, then it means everyone's in, and less they self-select out, but we're not excluding as sort of that premise of the elevator shaft, to use Kristen's analogy. We have already some comments and questions in the chat box. So Shara asked the question about how do we move the dialogue from norms forward so that inclusion goes from a nice to do to have to the imperative that it needs to be, especially knowing that resources are going to be tighter coming out of the pandemic. So Darby, maybe you can comment on this, but I've heard the quote that to build an accessible facility from the get-go, it's about 1% more versus the retrofits that usually are 10% plus more. So maybe we'll start with you and then flip it to Kristen after for that question.
Sure. Well, one, it starts with the big vision of getting the architects and who's ever designing the space on board to understand that people are people and that we have to include everyone no matter what. But yeah, really, it's, you know, you're right. It's roughly around a 1%, depending on the project, depending on the dollars. You know, that always plays a factor. I think for us, the biggest thing is getting involved early. So getting involved in, you know, even concept napkins. Hey, I'm all about sitting around a bar, having a beer, drawing stuff on napkins about the new project. You know, getting in at that stage where we can actually incorporate the accessibility from the start, so that we don't go into a scenario like we have here with the Calgary Public Library, where accessibility wasn't necessarily included in it and the building opened and then it just got blasted. And by being at the table during concept and schematic, we're able to help mitigate those problems, and it's more cost effective too for the client, because what might cost them, you know, $25,000 or $50,000 to have us involved could then, you know, cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars to retrofit when they start getting complaints or so on. So it's starting, and especially with the new Accessible Canvas Act, the federally regulated companies are definitely making a step forward towards it. But it's baby steps. We're extremely early in that scenario, and we do have a ton of work to do. So the more and more we can get the architects to buy in on the individualism and treating everyone as a person, then we're better off when we design buildings moving forward.
Fantastic. Kristen, do you want to take a stab at that one as well?
Absolutely. I really support what Darby was saying. It was interesting what she's saying about the architects buying into it. And that really struck a note with me, because a couple of things. One is, this really takes thought leadership. Mm-hmm. And when people, and I love the question by it's a really great question that the person has asked online, because what we're actually talking about is that we need that thought leadership. We need that person. We need architects to engage the communities. We need to hear the people talking who are living that lived experience. And I mean, Darby and I'm going to say this because it's a very problematic issue. If we look even in our sporting world, is how that there tends to be, in terms of when it comes to games development and so on, it ends up being in a very vertical, narrow silo, and a lot of white elephants get created, and a huge expanse and waste of governmental funding. So because there's been a lack of social integration and diversification in the initial planning. So it really takes thought leadership. And I think, you know, from my own experience in the built environment, I can share with you as well. I won't tell you the project, but I just recently finished in the last couple of weeks, a project that was which is called mass timber, and it's new technologies where there's actually no steel in the building. It's actually timber built technology, environmental. It meets all the LEED standards, and so on. But it was interesting when I was working with the architect at the time, because I came in at around the 30% of the design process, very much what Darby was just talking about. You come in at the end of the design process rather than at the beginning of it, and that's part of the design thought leadership piece. But I think what was really interesting, because here was a building that was focused on sustainability. It was focused on all the environmental bells and whistles. And then when I asked the question about, what about accessibility issues? And their faces just went completely blank. And they were kind of like, and they were dumbfounded. So they mentioned the AODA standards, which we're all very familiar with. And I said, so you designed for the very minimum standards in terms of in this beautiful, sophisticated, leading edge LEED building, hitting all the sustainability environmental pieces. But why did you design it in terms of the accessible piece for the people working in the space, right? They were more concerned about winning their awards. There's not going to be a shovel in the ground until the next couple of months. The building is not going to be built for the next 2.5 to 3 years. But here they had an opportunity to design something that is completely designed with the ideals of human-centered design. So when we're talking, I mean, the basic AOD standards are talking about tactile signage and iconography, increased stall space, single stall space, and so on, and door width accessible when it comes to accessible devices, right? So there's a clear limitation on how people understand what accessibility is. Like there's issues around the physiology, there's issues around mental health, vision, hearing, all aspects of how the body changes or has issues that of difference. I don't want to limit it as being calling it a disability, because most of the people who are living in these experiences are very healthy people in the first place and living very healthy lives. It's us who are designing these spaces that are applying those limitations. So that's my initial thinking around this. And it was interesting in terms of this particular case. The client, with the designer, the architects were more concerned about the awards piece and the LEED piece rather than the actual function and how it works within community. So that comes back to the design leadership and thinking of architects in kind of rethinking and how they are actually designing their spaces and their buildings and the reasons why they're doing it in the first place, and how that weaves to ensure healthy community, let alone healthy workplace for the people working in those spaces.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because so many pieces that you just touched on actually were probably the first conversation Darby and I had where we were talking about build design and frustrations and, people needing the building code and then being really upset when the building code really was not anywhere near what they needed to do to make it work for and function for both the building users, but any building user that might come in. So one of the things I want to kind of circle back on, in terms of your own, each of you's lived experience, tell me a little bit about sort of navigating some of those buildings and places and spaces and what you needed to both feel safe, to feel welcomed, to feel like you belonged in them. So from your personal experience, which you've now obviously taken both of you into sort of your professional lives, but what are some of the things that you value and that you need to show up in order to feel like you belong there? Darby, do you want to lead?
Sure. I think the biggest thing that I deal with a fair bit is getting through the front door. That seems to be one of the biggest challenges right now, is the fact that we are segregating people and making persons with disabilities or garbage ramps, as they're known, to go in and have these conversations or enjoy a nice meal or meet with people. So I think, for me, the biggest challenge would be, opening that door and getting people to understand that the front door is the front door and it should be for everyone, and that we work to mitigate that, but then also washrooms. A lot of the times we seem to be forgetting about washrooms, and when it comes down to it, a lot of times they do them as tiny as possible. They do turning radiuses because of code, no doubt, is so far behind us. It's about 30 years behind us. That's how far we're designing buildings. Like, that's the big difference. Is code is 30 years behind how we actually today live. And by following code, especially in washrooms, for those of us like myself who use a scooter to get around, can't use my manual chair anymore because I just don't have the arm strength. But to use my scooter to get into washrooms, and if we only do it just to code, it's extremely tight, or I can't even get in to start with. So it's about thinking outside the box and expanding that circle and expanding who's using the space. It goes back to that, and throwing, to some extent, the code out the door, because it is so far behind, and use it to consider. So for me, I think our two biggest issues would be the front door, getting in, and then the washroom aspect.
Okay, what about you, Kristen? I love that washrooms came up. Washrooms always seem to be such a hotbed, and I bet, Kristen, with some of your experience, there's probably another whole layer to that. So why don't you dive in?
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other conversation. I'm just taking in what Darby was just saying, and I'm deeply moved what she's saying. And it's something I shared with her earlier, and it's been before we came online with everybody, was that the one thing some of my greatest lessons have been through my diversity. I mean, I lived through my diversity and the challenges that I did, and I'm grateful for my diversity, because I would have grown up in that Canadian, living in that strata, never knowing what diversity was about, and I would have been completely alienated, never thinking how the decisions that are being made around the built environment and how other diverse groups, and I understand what diversity is now, and the broadness of what that term encompasses, umbrellas. And I think I understand what that feels like, and I can to a point of my own life experiences and the limitations of which that has been put upon me, but there's other layering levels much deeper for other individuals in terms of Darby's experiences, in terms around the accessibility issues, and also of different cultural and race issues that are systemic in our country. And these things are all weaved together. So in terms of my experience, it's in terms of the workplace experience, for me, it's not so much an accessibility in terms of my physical ability, but it is though an illustration to me, having seeing at a corporate level the lack of diversification in the workspace. And so we always talk, and many of the professional groups, and maybe this is another way of talking about it, when we're talking about diversification and in terms of the design processes and the teams that are creating and kind of forward thinking in the thought leadership, is that we always look at a lot of the discussion around diversification in the workplace, meaning hiring more women in the workplace. Right? It's not about hiring all different, a much greater layering of diversity. And so it affects the educational structure. Obviously, then it affects all the social issues and economic issues that are displaced within our society that we're all familiar with. And so that part of it has to change, because that was the limits that were placed on me as an individual, like 15 years ago. As you've read my book, I could have been living on the streets of Toronto, right? And a lot of people don't understand. They see me now today living a professional life, but the layering down of the system, of that hierarchical system, because the sporting system put me out in a public space, that no one knew how to manage that. And I think that's also part of the issues around diversity as a whole. As I'm talking to you, I'm coming to this right now, is that we are placing limits on people because we don't understand it, right? Rather than coming forward and allowing survivors or people living the lived experience and creating forums to allow professionals to hear the people living in those experiences. So that comes down to the thought leadership and this greater collaboration and weaving together of expertise. So we are designing the built environments under that bigger umbrella of human-centered design, and being able to create design environments that are facilitating that thought leadership and also that greater design thinking, that design leadership, right? And that's what's missing in this whole conversation. We need to start at the bottom, not at the top down. We have to reverse that, and that's where we have to begin this conversation, because we can't continue building the way we are today, because those buildings are going to be around for another 40, 50, 60 years. And I look at downtown Toronto right now, in middle of COVID right now, And it's teaching a lot of great lessons, as Toronto just, last year was seen having biggest cities in North America having more cranes in the sky, and we were rah, rah, rah about that. Now nobody wants the workspace, right? Because of the virus and how it's impacted downtown Toronto. So there's great lessons being learned. And I think what it does, it brings us all back together to have these very discussions we're having today.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Kristen, and kind of starting with at the bottom, as you said, with the people, and considering how diverse everyone in society is and what those lived experiences are and how we elevate those to really inform how we move forward. I want to circle back to a question that Mark asked earlier. Mark, I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit to kind of fit with where we're at in the conversation, but in that lived experience and the diversity of the people that are involved in our systems, how do we really intentionally involve them to help us shift the mindset so that not only are they contributing to the solutions that will ultimately benefit them, but we actually compensate and appreciate that contribution in a way that's meaningful, and we're not asking them to volunteer, because we tend to, in particular with marginalized or at-risk populations, kind of capitalize on their learnings, which further moves oppression forward. So how do we kind of flip that paradigm? So I'm going to turn that maybe back to Kristen to kick us off.
Actually, do you mind if can I push that back to Darby? Do you mind if she
Sure.
I need to think about that a bit, and I know she'll have a lot to say.
I can handle it. I think, from level playing field's point of view and my point of view, is sort of, that's why we started Level Playing Field, is the fact that I was getting tired of providing that information as a volunteer. And I think one of the biggest aspects is the fact that when you work as a volunteer, yes, they take the information, but do they actually apply it? Is sort of how it works. So I, with starting Level Playing Field, that took away the whole, they have to pay us for our service. So therefore, if they don't really want to take what we have to say, then that's okay. We still get paid for it, but we're taken more seriously. And with Level Playing Field, we also, depending on our projects like BMO Expansion and some others, we've actually brought in the different disability groups as, and have stakeholder engagement sessions where we've gotten different feedback for those. So we've included that network type of thing. But it does go back to the fact that when people see like foundations and stuff like that, they see it as being a volunteer aspect, and Level Playing Field is not. We're a for-profit, and therefore people have to pay us for our service, which then, is starting as we are working with the architects, especially our local guys here, they're starting to understand the impact that by paying us and having us involved helps them and makes them better and makes the projects better. But no, there's a big push of, I've been there about the whole volunteer thing, and it actually really drives me nuts because we should be valued. I think, Kristen, you're right on a lot of points, and the fact that everybody's should have their own opinions on stuff, and they should be valued, and by asking people to volunteer and to not get compensated for that is a little difficult.
Kristen, you want to build on that?
First of all, I love the question. By the way, it's a wonderful question to be asked, and it's right on point. And I love what Darby was just saying. And something that comes to mind is kind of leading with social impact, right? And thinking and starting off the conversation in that way. And I mean, I'm as Darby, and I'm sure like the three of us on this call, and I'm sure many people who are listening to us have done our share of work for various organizations in the design world, but also in the sporting world as well. And again, it comes down to, it's the design of the hierarchical system, because a lot of the organizations that I've done, I've helped to facilitate so in terms of my own understanding of diversity and in that supporting trajectory, even at the federal level. It's been very problematic because at the same time, it's still the same decision makers at the top of the funnel. And at the end of the day, it comes down to end dollars and so on. So I would like to believe, and I can tell you from what I'm seeing at the international sport level globally, the COVID-19 has put, and I can use this as an example, the COVID-19 has put right at their doorstep that it's a fundamental shift in terms of how we even see the trajectory for the mega sports events like the Olympics, like FIFA football, and the Commonwealth Games, for instance, as an example, and that they can no longer lead with the ideals of building infrastructure. The lead now is the social impact piece. And that's the actual value to these organizations is the global network that they have. It's not the infrastructure piece. That's the idea is the integration of how we design space around a major games. The major games idea is the kind of the starter conversation to be able to help design areas of like particularly in undeveloped areas of the world to be able to push investment, to be able to help support the economics and education and development in those areas of the world. So no longer is because as we're watching right now going on with professional sports in North America and also in Europe with football, and also what we're seeing with the IOC, unfortunately, with Japan and so on, we're watching the vulnerability because they have always kept their thinking in this kind of vertical elevator shaft, and also with the ideas of the very simple ideas around sustainability, the ideas of accommodation and inclusion, and not really thinking with the ideas around what it means to have the ideas of resilience and focusing on that more of a human-centered design approach, because we would not be they and we would not be in this position that we are, and would be in a lot more progressive position to be able to defend ourselves against COVID-19. So I believe that what this is doing is teaching many great lessons in how we have to think about this and put the social piece ahead of the infrastructure piece.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic way forward, Kristen. So Teddy's put a question in the chat box, and is there a gold standard for this work somewhere in the world, a place that has actually gotten these issues right? And I don't know, Teddy, if you're meaning infrastructure or if you're meaning sort of inclusion and diversity and considering people first. So, but maybe we'll flip it back to either Kristen or Darby to kick us off and sort of who's getting it right, who's doing either of those things right.
I can speak initially to that because I think I know what Teddy's talking about, because I think, well, again, where it's happening is not happening in North America, and it's not happening in kind of more Western societies, and there's real health concerns that there's a lot of research around this, in that especially around hosting of major games, where some of this research has been done which shows that by hosting a major games, either New Zealand, Australia, Canada, in the United States, and so on, and obviously in the UK, there is actually a negative impact to the local community's health long term. The legacy pieces that are structured around health and well-being doesn't mount up because there is no social legacy piece aligned to a major games investment. So that's very clear. And I think where we're seeing the success, to answer Teddy's question, is in other Scandinavian nations, also down in Malaysia and in Singapore areas, and also obviously in Saudi Arabia. What we also know too is that over 65 to 70% of the countries by 2050, in terms of when we talk about sporting events, won't be able to host sporting events because the environmental changes that are going on, it's just too hot, and won't be able to sustain events because of the changes of our environment. So there is tremendous implications to all of this. But what we're seeing, though, the architects in Scandinavian nations and also in the South Pacific areas of the world are really starting to lead that conversation because they're the ones that are highest impacted by the environment currently. And so we're seeing a lot of progressive changes. I'm not saying that no one's doing it right, but there is significant changes and thought leadership in this space to what we're talking about today.
Yeah, and to just second that, she's right. Like those countries are definitely making the step forward. We do have the Rick Hansen Foundation here in Canada. They've started rolling out the Rick Hansen certification, and there's a gold standard as part of it, but it's really to code. So it's just a start. It's a stepping stone. It's a good start for people to start having that conversation in regards to accessibility, but it's not the be all end all. And definitely, you know, we look to overseas and the Scandinavian countries and stuff like that, even Dubai, who are really leading the force when it comes to accessibility and accessibility. And Australia even. There's so many more places that are a lot more forward thinking and that are a lot farther along than we are here in North America. The ADA is great. It's definitely a great starting point. Rick Hansen, yeah, it's a great starting point. We do it here at Level Playing Field, but it's not. As much as, you know, we talk about LEED and platinum and all that stuff and the WELL AP and all that. It's just another program. It's just another sort of somewhat gimmick that people are like, "Ooh, we gotta go champion accessibility. Let's go get this certification." But really, in all fact, what does it truly do other than puts a sticker on your building? But yet, maybe somebody with vision loss, that doesn't necessarily help them because the items within the certification program aren't that detailed. So don't get me wrong, it's a fabulous starting point, and I'm glad we're having the conversation in and around the Rick Hansen, but it's not, you know, as much as they say, well, gold certification yippee, it's the code. So it basically speaks to code, which is where I know one of the other questions in the chat was about code, and I know there's push to try and make changes. Like anything, we all know how the speed of government works, which is snail's pace, and so it's trying to make those changes and make them work correctly. But it's years down the line, and here's hoping with the Accessible Canada's Act, especially for Canada, that'll make a big difference. But like anything, I'd say we're still 5 to 10 years out before that really plays a major factor in anything.
Yeah, we've definitely got a ways to go. So we're at that time, as we seem to run into every week, where we're kind of at wrap-up comments. So I'm going to turn it back to Kristen to kind of give your last thoughts on this conversation, any last words that you feel you didn't get to share already, and then Darby, will turn it over to you.
I first want to thank you both. I think, and everybody that's online listening to us, I think this is a really important conversation. It's a timely conversation, and I think some of the final comments that Darby was just making now, you know, in terms of the terms of how long this is going to take, it really is an emphasis on the changes within ourselves. Because even when we look at COVID and how we have been fighting the issues around the environment, and we're all seeing how the economic impact is going to be, but we're watching even in 3 months how the environment has changed back, and showing by us humans moving away from the environment, how the environment starts to come back in a healthy way, and the lowering of pollution and the growth within the broader environment worldwide. We've seen that, and how animals are coming back and flourishing. You know, we are the problem, and we need to be understanding that we are the problem. We also need to become the solution. And the only way we're going to be becoming the solution is if there is a collaboration and us all coming together as one. And it can be done. We've shown through COVID by accident. And all the fears and everybody fearing the economic impact, and how if we cut back on fossil fuels and all those other things, the world is going to collapse. But we're seeing our footprint impact in the world. And so what we have done, we have socially designed this. So it's up to us collectively as a group to rethink the language and how we think about this, and how we align ourselves as a society, and look at the society we want in the future. Because right now, the change is happening now, because I'm just sharing with everybody, I'm seeing at the international sports level. They have to change, and they have to do it within the next 6 years to 10 years. Or they won't, the international sport as we know it will not exist, or at least in the structure that we understand it to be today and what we're familiar with traditionally. So that is very fundamentally the same shift that has to happen in society. And that's where the architects need to come into play and change their design thinking and their thought leadership around this, and looking at just what Darby has illustrated beautifully today and articulated really well, is that the need to bring people in of that lived experience and moving these things along, so we're not seen as a ticked off box in the discussion. Okay, we've got somebody in accessibility, we've got somebody in diversity. You know, we need to be part of that broader conversation from the beginning right through to the end. And that's where we're all going to be a success, because when we're building structure, this structure is going to be in place for 60 to 70, 80, 90 years, right? So all we're doing is continuing to reflect that same kind of colonial vertical thinking, and that we need to shift that. The need is now to shift, not 10 years from now. And that's where fundamentally we have to do this. So it is a collective discussion that needs to happen now.
No, and I completely second what Kristen said. We definitely have to keep having these conversations and opening the doors to the discussion. And we need people to challenge certain scenarios and step up and say stuff. Because if we all sit back and stay quiet, nobody makes a difference. So it's key to keeping, you know, accessibility on the forefront. Especially, you know, it's nice to see the Paralympics now getting a lot of push and money and at the forefront, and we need that, just like we need the Olympics. So we need to help continue this movement along and the conversation along to making sure that these games, whether it's Olympics or Paralympics, are truly open to everyone and anyone, really. But thank you, ladies. I really appreciate this conversation. It's been fun. It's been a fun week chatting with you in regards to this. So I hope everybody's taken away something from this conversation. And like anything, always feel free to reach out. Always happy to have the conversation with anybody in regards to accessibility and how we remove barriers and put things forward.
No, that's great, and that's a great invite, Darby. I will share your website out in the email that goes out to the participants afterwards, so folks can know how to get in touch with you. And I'm just so grateful. I get to meet the most amazing people across this country, and I actually didn't know either Darby or Kristen ahead of COVID. So one of my gifts in COVID is meeting some really amazing people, mostly on Zoom, and I really look forward to the opportunity to sit down and have that beer, Darby, and and scribble on bar napkins. So yeah, it's just been a gift to have both of you here today, and to have the opportunity for you to share your expertise and your lived experiences with this group. And we'll look forward to sharing the recording out so others can join the conversation. I'm sure there's many more pieces that folks will find interesting as they kind of reflect on this and they know they can reach out. So I want to just wrap up the session today by, again, thanking our panelists and thanking each of you for being here, and acknowledging that next week we continue the Bridges of Belonging conversation on, it says Wednesday, it's Tuesday, June 30th, with Dr. Janice Forsyth, who is the Director of Indigenous Studies at Western University in Ontario, and Beth Hudson, who's an Indigenous sport leader in Northwest Territories. So it's going to be a really phenomenal conversation, and I look forward to having folks join us again next week. Have an amazing week. Stay safe, and thank you again for joining us. Thank you to Darby and Kristen.
Thank you.
Thank you.